Welcome back to 5D Mystery School, and I just have a quick question for you before we get started on the next lecture. And the next lecture is called Lost History, and it's going to be connected to the previous lecture, which was called Our Real Identity. So my question is this: if ancient Hebrew artifacts were found in America, and the original inhabitants of this land were black in phenotype, then the conclusion would be that the original Jews were black. And like I said before, and did my best to prove, I believe that the ancient Israel that was spoke of in the Bible was actually here in America. So if that's the case, where do modern day Orthodox Jews originate from, if the promised land was here? Again, this isn't to offend anybody, this is just to get some truth about our real history. Again, the next lecture is coming this week. I just wanted to preface it with this question. And there were a few comments that told me to study African history, but my college degree is in African history, so there's that. And just a quick side note, I have Jupiter in Aquarius in my third house, and my moon is in Virgo, so when I present something to you, it has been researched and studied thoroughly and confirmed by divine guidance. Look, we have a lot to uncover here in 5D Mystery School, especially in this next lecture. Thank you guys for being here. Make sure you follow on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and take care of yourself. I'll see you next time. Love you. Peace.
5D Mystery School.
What if I told you that Tartarians were here in America, and their history here goes a lot deeper than you might think? But before we get there, we got some ground to cover. But stay tuned.
5D Mystery School.
Hey guys, welcome back to 5D Mystery School. Let's get into it. First, I just want to say I do see all of your comments. I appreciate you guys. Although I don't have the emotional bandwidth to reply to everything because there's a lot, I am grateful for you all. Every lecture has a divine time, and I do feel as though I am being divinely guided. So you choosing to spend your time in this human experience here in 5D Mystery School means the world to me. Just wanted to get that out. This is Lost History Part 1. And here are the sources before we get started. And the warning, there will be some jumping of parts ahead in time and then coming back. Now, I would advise you to go watch the Sims lecture that I did. Although it is 100 parts, I feel like it is worth it. And Our Real Identity, the lecture before this. I'm not sure how long this is going to take, but I'll make this as fast as I can. Okay, so the Holy Bible could also be referred to as the Heliobiblios, which means the Book of the Sun. As mentioned before, the Bible is a collection of allegorical parables that are meant to awaken your soul whenever you are ready. So then, it shouldn't be taken literal. So first what I do is give you an example of some symbolism, then we'll pull a short parable from the Bible, and then from there we're going to dive deep, and it's probably going to take some turns you're not expecting. So my apologies if anybody gets lost along the way, but if you have any questions, put them in the comments. And if I can't get to your question, we have some really, really intelligent students here, or really intelligent peers here at 5D Mystery School. And I promise you that they will answer your question, at least from what I've been seeing. Okay, so the Helios Biblios should have been a book about astrology, because absolutely everything is encoded and refers to the Zodiac or the stars or constellations or planets or other flat planes. But that's for later. Okay, so I'm not going to decipher the whole Bible right now, but let's start off with the word church. Hallelujah. Church is derived from the ancient Greek minor goddess Circe. She is an enchantress and a minor goddess in ancient Greek mythology and religion. So she is the daughter of Helios, the sun god, and of the ocean nymph Perse. Now keep the name Helios in mind. Now, from my perspective, I believe that church is one of the control methods for unseen forces. You see the cross on top there? Here's different variations of it, different religions or civilizations, but they all point to the same thing. Keep that in mind for later. Now let's take the Christian cross. Now the cross represents the directions of the flat earth plane. You have north, east, west, and south. Fun side note, that's where they get news. Okay, so the first book of the Bible is Genesis, which also stands for Gene Isis. And this is symbolic for the divine feminine energy. Okay, so Gen also stands for generation, or taken from the etymology of Greek, it means genius, meaning born, to give birth. Then, of course, Isis, she was an Egyptian nurture goddess, representing the divine feminine in Egyptian culture, Egyptian religion. So Genesis represents the divine feminine energy. And one more thing, Isis also represents divine, spiritual, feminine wisdom. But when Pharaoh Akhenaten came back into power, he outlawed the religion of Isis and put back into power the worship of the sun. So how did it go from talking about the Bible to Egyptian culture religion? Don't worry, we'll get there. The new religion was Amun-Ra. The new converts were worshiping Sun-Ra, or sun rays. This is why Amun-Ra is always shown with the sun behind him, because he represents the sun. Side note, Horus also represents the sun. Keep that in mind. But Amun-Ra, this is why modern day prayers end with Amen. Amen. Now, as they tell it, when the Hebrews left captivity to Palestine, they ran into the god El, aka Saturn, who rules over Palestine. Now, if you take Isis, Ra, and the god El, you would get Israel, Israel. So as mentioned before, the Book of the Sun has many references to astrology. So then, Jesus is symbolic for the sun. This is why he always has a sun behind him. Take note. Here's a few references to the stars. Canst thou find sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazareth in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? But let me pause. What does Mazareth mean? We can't skip over that. Mazareth is a biblical Hebrew word found in the book of Job, and literally means constellations according to the 10th century biblical exegete, while others interpret the word as garlands of crowns, but its context is that of astronomical constellations and is often interpreted as the term for zodiac, or the constellations thereof. And notice they have a zodiac wheel here. So here are other references to Jesus representing the sun. Canst thou lift up thy voice to the clouds, that abundance of waters may cover thee? And this is talking about making it rain. Now, here are a couple of verses referring to Jesus as the light of the world. I'm going to bring your attention to John 9:5. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. You know what else that statement is true for? Because when the sun leaves your location, it's night, right? So next time you hear about Jesus wearing a crown of thorns, just know that the crown of thorns are symbolic for sun rays. So yes, Jesus is coming back tonight around 8:30 p.m. So our subconscious mind is filled with symbolism every single day that refers to sun worship. And I'm just going to show you a few examples to better explain this. Good look at the sun god Helios. Almost instantly, what does this remind you of? Let's take another look. Who does this remind you of? That's right, the Statue of Liberty is symbolic for Helios, the sun god. Let's take a look at another example. You would think that Shell gas station would have a shell for their logo, but if you take a closer look, that is actually a sunrise. One more, here's BP gas station logo. If you take a close look, that is a sun. The cross with the circle is a representation of the sun ruling all four directions of the flat earth plane, and our reality coming from the center. Just like a Torah field, with the field being the ether. If you watched my Sims lecture, we already went over this. The entire story of Jesus and every other protagonist from every major religion is the story of light versus dark. You have the protagonist, which is a holy man like Jesus usually, and then you have the antagonist, and in Christianity it's the devil. It's literally the battle of daytime versus nighttime. And this theme can be witnessed in several Hollywood movies. Over and over and over again. Luke Skywalker, the meaning is in the name, Skywalker. And Darth Vader is like Earth Fader, which is the moon. The moon fades the light from the earth. King just represents the constellation of Leo when the sun enters the constellation of Leo, which used to be the beginning of summer. But at the start of the summer, that's when the sun is the highest point in the sky. And every single day, it takes one step. It moves 1 degree. So at the end of 90 days, it will have moved 90 degrees. And at that point, the sun moves over the equator into fall or autumn because the sun is falling, and that's why we call it fall. At that point, the sun moves over the equator. Celebrate the Passover. Other religions celebrate the resurrection. I want to bring your attention to Joshua 10:13. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. Notice the emphasis on the sun in this rotation. What is the rotation of the sun? Does this symbol look familiar? Infinity is that which is boundless, endless, or larger than any natural number. It is often denoted by the infinity symbol. Of course, it's also symbolic of the Ouroboros. It can be seen in our reality. So represents 8. We talked about this in another lecture. The number 8 represents a new beginning, a new order of creation, man's true born-again event, resurrected from the dead. The sun does this every day. So the symbol for Jesus is a fish, and this represents the sign of Pisces. As we mentioned before, Jesus is symbolic for the sun. And as you see here, Jesus is in the middle of a fish. This represents the sun being in the sign of Pisces. As you can see by this verse here, he replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters." So the key words here is the man carrying a jar of water and the house that he enters. Okay, so the man carrying the jar of water is the sign of Aquarius, known as the water bearer. And when they say follow him to see what house he enters, they're just referring to the 12 houses of the natal chart. And after Pisces, which is the sign used for Jesus, you can see the next is Aquarius, meaning the age of Aquarius is going to be preceding the age of Pisces. Alright, so some more symbolism surrounding Jesus. The 4 gospels that followed him were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are representation of the 4 seasons: spring, summer, fall, and winter. And the 12 disciples are representation for the 12 signs of the Zodiac, the 12 houses of the natal chart, the original 12 planets, 12 months in a year, 12 hours in the day, and 12 at night. Of course, 12 in numerology is 3, and that's why 3 is always associated with the creation story. Alright, keep this in mind. In regards to Christianity, this represents the Holy Trinity: the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, or Holy Ghost. This can also represent the sun, the moon, and the sky, or the sun, the black sun, and the ether, however you want to look at it. The story of Jesus was borrowed from many ancient religious texts: the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Torah, the ancient Egyptian text. Here you have Jesus, Buddha, and Krishna, same energetic being, 3 different stories. One step further, take a look at the similarities between all of these different religions in their origin story. You had Horus, Mithra, Dionysus, Adish, Krishna, and Jesus Christ. Taking it one step further in connection with the humans, 12 disciples are representation of the 12 cranial nerves of the human brain. 12 cranial nerves, 12 disciples, 12 constellations. But as I mentioned, the Bible was borrowed from Egyptian texts, so the Egyptian god Amun-Ra, which was depicted with ram horns, is an area of our brain called the hippocampus. Egyptians were master surgeons. They were able to pull your entire brain through your nose, so they knew every inch of the body. So a lot of symbolism points back to the body. Take a look at the symbolism crucifixion and the connection with the pineal gland. The brain is the eye of Horus, the scarab beetle is the human skull, the back of the skull is the Holy Grail, the brain even represents Ganesha. Okay, so I keep bringing up the similarities between the Egyptian creation story and the modern day biblical creation story because it's important. Before I get to that, here is sun worship depicted in the Incan culture, Egyptian, and Hindu. Now here are a few more ancient sun worship artifacts. Now I was analyzing this Aztec medallion, and a lot of people believe it's a calendar, but I'm beginning to believe this is symbolic for the sun and the directions of the sun over the flat earth plane, and how the sun rules the flat earth plane, and the sun is in the middle, just like other depictions. Alright, here's another, and another. I like this sun, it got some soul. Here's another, and another. Here's one of the oldest. You might recognize this from Egypt. And here's another. Now here's my question to you. And just as a warning, The following message might put you in a state of experiencing cognitive dissonance. Shout out to UB News for this Old Testament map. Now, as mentioned before, I believe that the Egypt and the Israel and Babylon, Mesopotamia, spoken about in the Bible was actually here in the United States. Now, let's support this theory. This is an article, The Ancient Egyptian Creation Story, written by Brandon West. Go check out this full article if you're interested. The ancient Egyptian creation story is one of the oldest known to us, predating the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, codified maybe circa 650 BCE, by more than 2,000 years. There are certain similarities, though important distinctions, also between the traditions of Mesopotamia, which are ancestral to the biblical narrative, and those of Egypt. You can pause to read the rest. Here's an article by John Oakes, Is the Story of Noah a Stolen or Borrowed Myth? Keep the story of Noah in mind for later in this lecture. Now, this article goes on to speak about the similarities between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Bible, Genesis in particular. Pause to read some more. Old Testament tales were stolen from other cultures by Garrett S. Griffin. The first important lesson history can teach us concerning the pagan influences on modern religion is that the Jews were not the first monotheistic group. Not only did nearby cultures adopt the idea first, the Hebrews were not always monotheistic, continuing to worship many lesser gods long after they accepted Yahweh as their primary tribal god. Pause to read some more, a little bit more. This article goes on to talk about the Hebrews in Egypt. Pause to read. Now, this is important because the ancient Egyptian creation story is credited as the oldest, although some would probably argue to say it's the Sumerians. That's up for debate. As mentioned before, there are mounds mentioned in the Bible several times. The mounds that they were mentioning can be found right here in the United States, in several states. Alright, here's some more mounds. Coincidentally, you can find mounds in Little Cairo in Illinois. The truth is hidden in plain sight. Now, the mounds found in the United States predate the pyramids of Giza by a long shot. Now, if this is ancient Egypt and this is the land that they spoke of in the Bible, who built these pyramids? A serious question. Who built these pyramids? These pyramids were supposedly built in ancient times, but yet pictured here, they are not finished, and this was taken with a modern day camera. Pictured here, you can see these ancient Egyptian monuments are still being built in modern times. So who built them? Pictured here, you can see the Sphinx with no feet yet, under construction. Who built them? Serious question. You know the saying, if it's too good to be true, then it usually is. I've always had this inkling like these were just set up to set the simulation, set the world stage, to keep us chasing a false history, to hide the real history that we were already here. But they'll take our true history and hide it in plain sight, and then use it for their symbolism, making us think that it's evil, making us think our own history is evil. But they'll put it all around us. In cities like Memphis, that's connected to Egyptian roots, and we're left with the false evidence. So someone posed the question, why am I doing all of these parts? Why don't I just make one cohesive video and put it on YouTube? I thought that was a very good question. Oh, but before I forget, don't forget that this is your homework for the summer to watch this series. So the main reason I do my lectures like this is so that I can go back and read your comments and see if there's anything that I need to cover before moving on. My entire lectures are written out before I even make the first video. Some are like 10 to 20 pages. But I wanted to make this experience tailored to you guys by interactively going back and answering your questions as we move along. So that's what I'm gonna do here. So I see some people had questions about the Sphinx being built. There were some people that said that this was just construction going on, some rebuilding going on, some touching up. But when it comes to ancient artifacts and ancient structures like this, it's usually in the best interest of historians to preserve them, not by editing them and doing construction on them. So by all means, from the viewpoint of a researcher or just any inquisitive mind, this seems odd. Especially seeing how ancient civilizations built inside of the ground. And some of those ancient civilizations constructed underground tunnel systems that run across the entire country and to other countries. But that's an entirely different lecture. So I know it's hard to digest the possibility that this Egyptian history is falsified. But as a reference point to better solidify this idea in your consciousness, let me show you some other history that has been falsified. And I'm making a short pivot here because I think that this is vital before moving on. Okay, so hopefully most of you are familiar with Stonehenge. Stonehenge is a prehistoric monument on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England, 2 miles or 3 kilometers west of Amesbury. These stones are set within earthworks in the middle of the densest complex of Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments in England, including several hundred tumuli or burial mounds. Now, with this in mind, if it's from the Neolithic and Bronze Age, explain these photos of their construction during modern times. Take a look. Let it register. Alright? John 8:32. Then you will know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Alright, take a look. Modern day construction of an ancient site. Okay? The stage of the simulation has been set to make us believe that our reality dates back a lot further than it actually does. Why would they hide the truth? And one more for clarity. Taking it one step further, even some sites that you believe are natural have been created to falsify a history. Oh, let me throw in allegedly. Don't want to get this video banned. Take a look. How would they build these sites? It takes a lot of work. How would they cut down the true trees? The tree grew large and strong and its top touched the sky and it was visible to the ends of the earth. Here's one way it's done. Another way it's done. Is this real? Okay, so I think we've been over a good amount of symbolism from the Helios Biblios. Now the next step is to pull a parable from the book and apply the symbolism to that parable. And for this, I'll also use Egyptology and Greek mythology, just to show you the similarities. And for this, I'll use Noah and his 3 sons. Noah's sons are said to be the progenitors of all races on earth. Now, I'm not going to decipher as I read along. I'm just going to tell you the story as it's taught to other people, just so that we can trace the lineages of all people according to the Bible. All right, so first what I'm gonna do is show you Noah's lineage, and then I'm gonna show you the lineage of his sons. But just a reminder, there's a lot of symbolism. The Bible is an allegory, so not all names are referring to physical people. All right, so here's the lineage leading up to Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. You can see Enoch in there. That's a whole nother lecture. You see Cain and Abel. If you add their names, take the C, and then, Abel is like Cabal. That's why the elite or the hidden ones, they often use Cabal. Or at least that's the conclusion I came up with. Okay, so I drew out the lineage for Noah and his 3 sons, but then I remember Shem got busy. But you can see Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And then you'll really have to pause to look at this one, but this is from Noah, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, and all of their descendants. So you look at this family tree, and this is the progenitors of all races, according to the Bible. All right, so keep this in mind as we move along. Okay, so for most of you, a lot of what has been said up until now has been known to you. It's nothing new. In fact, part of your new homework assignment is to watch this Zeitgeist the movie, just so that you can understand what's being said. Okay, so the Helios Biblios in these parables isn't the oldest religious text. In fact, I've shown you the similarities between this and Greek mythology already in another lecture. Here's an article by Garrett S. Griffin. Old Testament tales were stolen from other cultures. I would definitely read this whole article if you want to know more. The first important lesson history can teach us concerning the pagan influences on modern religion is that the Jews were not the first monotheistic group. Not only did nearby cultures adopt the idea first, the Hebrews were not only monotheistic, continuing to worship many lesser gods long after they accepted Yahweh as their primary tribal god. This was a common event in ancient societies, as one god would rise to prominence among many. Pause to read the rest. In Egypt, it was Re, or Isis, or Ra, or Osiris, depending on the era. Babylon had Marduk, Assyria had Ashur, and the Hebrews had Yahweh. As time went on, Yahweh became not just a God for one people in one geographic area, but a universal God meant for all people, and indeed the only God to actually exist. So it just goes on to say, before Yahweh, it was Amenhotep. He destroyed the temples and forced monotheism, just like Akhenaten stopped the worship of Isis. Then it goes on to say there is no evidence of Hebrew enslavement in Egypt or in Exodus, nor evidence of Joshua conquering the Promised Land after a long wandering in the wilderness. But like I said, go and check it out. Then here's another article by John Oakes, is the story of Noah stolen or borrowed myth? And this article compares it to the Epic of Gilgamesh. It says the book of Genesis and the Gilgamesh epic are parallel. Then you can pause to check out the rest. But I'm just giving you other viewpoints, other perspectives. And he's a PhD that wrote this article. And the PhD just goes to show a background and research. And just a side note, at most Masonic lodges on display, they have the Bible right next to the Quran, the Tanakh, the Shinto text, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Jefferson Bible. And the Torah, usually. But according to my research, the text that predates them all is going to be the Egyptian text. And then from there, you can find all other similarities throughout the different religions. Horus, born on December the 25th, born of a virgin, star in the east, adorned by 3 kings, teacher at 12, baptized ministry at 30, 12 disciples. And that was in 3000 BC. Some researchers would tell you that you can refer to the Sumerian tablets, which were written in cuneiform, to find the origins of man on earth. But the ancient mounds found here in America predate what you would find in modern-day Egypt, along with the cave writings found here, belonging to Queen Califia and her crew. But we'll come back to her shortly. So when it comes to tracing real lineage, you have to look at hidden history. But back to this guy and his 3 sons, so we can trace the lineage that we've been taught. So first, Ham. You might see modern-day references to Ham, but let's talk about who he is. So if you know anything about the Egyptian creation story, Ham is the one that betrays his father. In this story, they say that Noah was asleep, naked. Ham came in the tent and he saw his father's nakedness. He came back to tell his brothers to go and look at his father as well. And then Noah cursed him, cursing Ham. But he didn't curse Ham, he cursed Canaan, Ham's son. We're just doing quick rundowns. All right, so next we have Japheth, and what I want you to remember about Japheth is that his son Gomer was the father of Ashkenaz, and his son Magog. And Shem's important, so remember most of his children, especially Abraham and Moab. Now, according to Zondervan Compact Bible Dictionary, Ham is the father of the dark races, but not the Negroes. All right, so we left off talking about Ham, also known as Hot. So it says he became the progenitor of the dark races, not the Negroes, but the Egyptians, Ethiopians, Libyans, and Canaanites. I know you heard of all these, especially the Canaanites. Here's a modern day reference, raising Canaan, as in Canaanites. Okay, so now let's talk about Japheth. It's really hard to find things about Japheth, but I got this from an ARC forum, and I thought it was pretty good. So remember, just quick rundowns. Alright, so it is taught that Japheth is the ancestor of the Chinese people because of the word enlarge. And just for a quick reference, here's the Bible verse that talks about Japheth and enlarging. But also take note, he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And remember, Canaan is a servant because Ham was cursed by Noah. Another connection that I made that makes the biblical Japheth the progenitor of the Asian races is, okay, so look at Japheth and his tree. Magog comes from Japheth. Now we're going to go to this article by The Trumpet. Is China in the Bible, the scriptural prophetic identity of the most populous nation on the planet, by David Vigil. And what word do you see there? Magog, migration of the Chinese. So before we get to Shem, we're just going to stick on Japheth for a second. But real quick, a breakdown of the three races. You have Caucasoid, Mongoloid, just pause to read these, and Negroid. The original term for Negroid was actually Ethiopian. Okay, now that you have that in your mind, let's continue. But what I want to point out from this part of the article is that there are actually more Mongols living in China than in Mongolia. Why is that? Well, as it's told, Noah's son Japheth married a woman of yellow race and went on to father the Mongoloid people. And the Hebrew word for Japheth means enlargement. And just for a quick side note, here's an article by Todd Edwards, Hebrew is Greek. And it just goes on to say Hebrew wasn't invented until after 1925 BC and has always been a liturgical language and not spoken by a common person. The lettering system alphabet utilized to write Hebrew words is Phoenician. In fact, all alphabetical languages writing systems come from the ancient Phoenicians. It's where we get the word phonics, to sound out a word for spelling. Another thing I want to point out, Hebrew words have a direct and very strong correlation to the Greek language in both word structure, rules, and sentence architecture. Alright, so back to this article by The Trumpet. It goes on to say, Japheth's descendants have long been the most populous people on Earth, with the bulk living in China, Southeast Asia, and Japan. Alright, so Genesis 10:2-5 says Japheth had 7 sons and an untold number of daughters. Here's a key part to remember. Obviously, these sons and daughters were a mix between the Caucasoid and Mongoloid races, the latter of which grew more definitive as subsequent generations. Like I said, it's going to be a lot of jumping back and forth, so I just wanted to give you another reference for Hebrew is Greek. This was a book published in 1982 by Beckett Publications in Oxford by Joseph Yehuda. Alright, so one of the 7 sons of Japheth bears special importance to the prophetic identity of the Chinese people, even their nomadic neighbors. That is Magog, the second son of Japheth mentioned in Genesis 10:2. I'm going to go back and tell you a little bit more about Ham before I go to Shem, but I'm doing it in this order for a reason. Continuing, where did Magog go? Alright, so it says the Bible primarily deals with Israel. However, Jewish historian Josephus indicated where Magog's descendants settled. He wrote in the 1st century, Magog founded those that from him were named Magagites, but who are by the Greeks called Scythians. Here's another key, remember that word? In a prophecy in Ezekiel 38, the Bible labels this vast territory of the northern Eurasia where the Scyths lived, a region that stretched from the Russian steppes east into modern-day China and Mongolia, as Magog. This territory contained many different tribes of people of white and yellow races, all of whom were called Scyths or Scythians by the Greeks. The people who most prominently settled this land are typically identified as Mongolic and Turkic. The name Mongol is even derived from the name Magog. Write that down. So according to ancient history, Turkic and Mongolic tribes have been vying for control of the area, and that's their backstory. So pretty much just going back and forth for control led to intermixing of the people, and it makes their national borders largely irrelevant to defining their ethnic backgrounds. Now earlier I said remember that Ashkenaz comes from Japheth's sons Gomer. So back to the question I asked the other day, who are the Ashkenazi Jews? Interesting that the last part of that name is Nazi. Anyway, the Jewish ethnic identity most readily recognized by North Americans, the culture of matzo balls, black-hatted Hasidim, and Yiddish originated in medieval Germany. And this was written by Rabbi Rachel M. Solomon. Go check it out if you're interested. I just wanted to read you that part. Essentially, I just traced back their lineage from the beginning. Moving on. Here's a photo of a Mongolian. Now spanning out, here's Koreans in the 1900s praying to African totems. Keep that in mind. As you can see, as more intermixing went on, these are the sand hunters from the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa. Here's more. Another descendant of the Mongolians. Note the phenotype. Here's another Mongolian. They don't teach you about the ones that are black in phenotype. Now you can really start to see intermixing here with Ethiopians or Negroids. Now I'm going to make a jump before we go back. Here's a girl who lived in Mexico 12,000 years ago. Note the facial features. So we left off showing you a reconstructed face of a teenage girl who lived in Mexico 12,000 years ago. Now take a look at her facial features. So she looked like she's Asian in origin, but how did she end up in Mexico? And does this migration have anything to do with the Native Americans, Aztecs, Mayans, Mexicans? Well, we'll get there. So by looking at your comments, I wanted to show you a few different perspectives. And here is the perspective of a Hebrew Israelite on wearehebrew.com. Who are Shem, Ham, and Japheth, or Japheth, however you want to say it. All right, Caucasians in the Caucasus Mountains. In the scriptures, we are told that Japheth migrated to the lands of the north, which belonged to them. When we look on a map, all the lands of the north are in Europe and Russia. And it shows you the scripture from Book of Jubilees 8:11 through 12. And all that is towards the north is Japheth's, and all that is towards the south belongs to Shem. This coincides with the modern day belief that Europeans, white people, come from the Caucasus Mountains. The Caucasus Mountains is where Europeans derive the term Caucasian today. On inspection, this is a confirmation of the Bible's flood and Noah's Ark. Again, this is a perspective of an Israelite, not mine, just to clarify, because some of you get confused. Then it says how the book of Jasher gives you more granular insight about the Gentiles and Japhetic people today. Skipping ahead, so above we see that Japheth has 7 sons. It's from these sons that we can deduce white Europeans or Caucasians originate. So if that's you, you're likely to be from one of these Gentile nations. You ever heard of the term, you're either a Jew or a Gentile? That's what this is referring to. All right, that's one perspective. Here's another. The first people were black, Adam, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the source is Light and Truth from the Library of Congress. It's a pretty credible source. All right, so you can pause to take a look at this, but I'm just going to point out one thing. The word Adam is derived as follows: Adam, Adama, Adami, Adma, which means earthy. The earth is a rich, dark substance, and from it our first parents were taken. So taking into consideration, these researchers were right about their explanations of the meaning of the terms. Then deduction must be that Ethiopia was black and the first people were Ethiopians or blacks. Then it goes on to say, the descendants of Ham, I have generally given the name Ethiopians, blacks with frizzle or curly hair. The descendants of Shem were denominated Assyrians and Syrians, blacks with long straight hair. Shem had 5 sons who inhabited the land from the Euphrates to the Indian Ocean and Abyssinia. Then it goes on to tell you about his sons. Stay with me, we have a lot to cover. But there's always debate back and forth between the descendants of Shem and Ham and the true lineage of melanated people. I think this is the best part of the article. I believe Japheth may have been an albino Negro because his father Noah was an albino Negro. And it says black peoples who populated Western Europe and the Mediterranean were Shemitic and Hamitic peoples. So just to finish this off, this also means that black peoples who populated Western Europe and the Mediterranean were Shemitic and Hamitic peoples, while Japheth was in Central Asia, where many say white people come from, and in the land of the Tartars. Keep Tartars in mind. We're going to be taking some twists and turns. One more perspective. Which of the 12 tribes of Israel was black? All right, so it says the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The descendants of Cush settled in Ethiopia. The descendants of Mizraim settled in Egypt. The Hebrew name for the country of Egypt is Mizraim. The English name Egypt comes from the Greek word Egyptos, not from Arabic or Hebrew. The descendants of Ham gradually populated Africa and are Hamitic. The descendants of Shem became Semitics. This is where you get the term Semitic or anti-Semitic. This is when you talk about people who are the descendants of Shem. Egyptians are Hamitic, not Semitic, even though they now speak a dialect of Arabic, a Semitic language. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Now, if you're a millennial who was in church, you know this song. Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's just praise the Lord, right arm, hey. But anyway, that was the song. So a lot of us already grew up with this belief. Y'all know black people in the church. Hallelujah! But fast forward, it says Jacob, who would have been named Yaqub, aka Israel, had 12 sons. And then it listed 12 sons, and then it says all these are the 12s of Israel. Just in case you're somebody who are wondering where the tribes originated. Here's an important note before moving on. Now here's a segment from another article. The name of the article is The Legend of the 10 Lost Tribes of Israel. Sorry, the name of the author got lost in research. But one thing I wanted to point out is, it says one pious member of the Scotch Kirk derives the Japanese from the lost tribes of Israel. The two greatest authorities on the subject, Bales and Rains, say purely and simply that the Japanese are Mongols. And this would make sense because, like I said, you have Mongoloid, Caucasoid, and Negroid. So if you're Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, from Laos, Thai, you belong to the Mongoloid race. Pause to read more. It says, it is historically certain that some Mongols have come over and settled in Japan, namely Koreans and Chinamen at various epochs of authentic Japanese history. And then it goes on to talk about the Battle of Gog and Magog, heralding the redemption of the Jewish people, and the revelation of the 10 lost tribes. We are now on the eve of the final struggle, which will result in the release of the rest of the Jewish race, both in China and Korea, from the yoke of their oppressors. The probability is that China, Japan, and Korea will again be reunited under the power of the Jewish race. All right, so read the rest of that. Okay, so a bit more before moving on, because this is important. This is from the website Got Questions. Who were the sons of Noah and what happened to them and their descendants? So Noah has 3 sons born to him, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, before God sent a flood to destroy the world. Whenever the names of Noah's 3 sons are recorded, Shem is always mentioned first. It's believed that he was the favorite. Japheth was the oldest and Ham was the youngest. Japheth was born when Noah was 500 years old and the flood came 100 years later. Shem was the ancestor of all the sons of Eber, and this is important because the word Eber is the origin of the Hebrew word for Hebrew. The word Shem means name, which implies that Noah expected this son's name to become great. He was right. The modern words Semitic and Semite are derived from Shem's name. Shem lived to be 600 years of age and became the ancestor of the Semitic peoples. Abraham, or Abram in the Bible, is a descendant of Shem, is the first person in the Bible who is referred to as a Hebrew. Noah blessed Shem above his brothers, and it was through Shem that the promised seed destined to crush Satan came. That seed is traced back to Adam's son Seth, through Shem, and on to Abraham, Judah, and David, leading all the way to Christ. Shem's son Elam was the father of the Elamites, who later settled east of Mesopotamia. And keep in mind, for this lecture, when they're talking about Mesopotamia, I'm referring to ancient America. Shem's son Asher, whose name is related to the word Syria, is most likely is the father to those who settled the ancient region of Assyria. And side note, when you look up the Assyrians, their appearance has a striking similarity to other people. Look at this. Okay, so here's an Assyrian. Take a good look. Long beard, curly hair. Assyrians, long beards, curly hair. Now here's the Anunnaki. Long beard, curly hair, similar in appearance. Another Anunnaki, and another Anunnaki. Now look at him, and look at him. Thought that was very interesting. Now moving on. All right, so read the rest of this. Okay, so the rest of this read talks about Japheth and Shem. And there's a verse that refers to Japheth living in the tents of Shem, since the ancestral patriarchy title went to Shem. According to this view, there was to be a time when God worked primarily with Shem, the people of Israel. But later, Japheth would be brought into connection with the faith of Israel to share Israel's blessings. A similar prophecy is evident in the Abrahamic covenant, where God promises to bless all nations through Abraham's seed. And remember, Abram or Abraham comes from Shem. All right, and the last of this says the Hamitic peoples are shown in Genesis 10:6-20 as becoming a godless and worldly power. It was the land of Israel that was assigned to Ham's son, Canaan, and for a century it was under the control of Egyptians. Now this says Ham is the father of the Arabians, Canaanites, and Africans, including the Egyptians. Due to Ham sinning against his father, Noah cursed Canaan, saying Canaan would be a servant to Shem. This was fulfilled centuries later when the Israelites entered the land of Canaan and subdued the inhabitants of the land. Okay, moving on. Alright, so a few loose ends before moving on. Here's an old article from the Internet Archive saying that Israel and Japan. If it is the truth that the Japanese are out of the Hebrew race and in their reigning family have a direct descent from the royal line carried away from Jerusalem over 700 years before Christ, then it is worthwhile to know it. This article concludes by saying, I believe that the plot of a grand drama is to be revealed someday when it will be seen that the literal seed of Abraham have pretty much inherited the earth. The great revolutions have been going on unnoticed by man, but often it has been one tribe of Israel supplanting another. An important note, the dictionary defines the Hebrew term Cushite as Moor in English. Make sure you're paying attention and taking notes, and spit out your gum. Okay, so just so you can put a name with the tribe, here you go. Remember where I said they originated from? Here's another clear reference. One more reference. Almost similar to zodiac signs. Keep that in mind. Okay, so real quick, keep this image in your head as we move along. Now earlier I said I was going to bring in Egyptology and Greek mythology. Okay, one important pivot. As mentioned earlier, in ancient times, Jacob translates to the name Yaqub. He is acknowledged as a patriarch of the Islam. Muslims believe that he preached the same monotheistic faith as did his forefathers, Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac. Yaqub was a black scientist who lived 6,600 years ago and began the creation of the white races. He is said to have done this through a form of selective breeding, which is referred to as grafting, while he was living on the island of Patmos. Take off the P is Atmos. And I like to do modern references just so you can know where some of these names came from. The Nation of Islam's theology states that Yaqub is the biblical Jacob, especially since there were no Jacobs back then. So whenever you see a name with a J, just replace it with a Y. So Jesus would be Jesus or Yeshua. Okay, so before we look at the Egyptian creation story, we're going to look at the Greek mythology creation story. Here's the entire creation story of the gods laid out, beginning with chaos. And if you want to know more about being born out of chaos, go back and watch my lecture about the Sims. As mentioned before, it's like over 100 parts, but I think it's worth it for you to better understand this lecture. So there are a lot of modern day Greek mythology references that you'll find in Hollywood and our society. So out of chaos came Uranus, Gaia, Tartarus, Eros, Erebus, and Nyx. Alright, so note the order that came out of chaos. Alright, and I broke down all the symbolic meanings of the name. Pause to read. Because in an allegorical myth, names have meanings, and they symbolize something. And here are more symbolic meanings of names. By now, you know Chronos means time. Okay, so before we move on to the next part, just take a note of all the names you see here. And just to break down one quick meaning, Gaia plus Uranus means heaven plus earth. So I just have to make a note that sometimes I'll record an entire video and then at the end, for some reason, it'll disappear or I'll have to restart over. TikTok, thank you for building up my patience, but please stop doing that. Okay, so as mentioned before, when reading religious texts or deciphering any type of mythology, you have to take into consideration that what you're reading is allegorical. So most of the names that you see are symbolic for something else. So I want you to take note of all of the names that you see here. And if you can't see these names, maybe this is a bit more clear for you. Now I want you to take note that this entire order was born from chaos. And on this tree specifically says chaos and Nyx. Nyx is the Greek goddess or personification of the night. A shadowy figure, Nyx stood at or near the beginning of creation and mothered other personified deities such as sleep, death, and darkness. And sleep, death, and darkness is associated with the night. So Nyx is the personification of the night, and with night you have sleep, death, and darkness associated with it. Another interesting side note, the name for death is Thanatos, almost similar to Thanos, who represented death. So Greek mythology is a good reference to use because you'll see a lot of symbolism that has to do with Greek mythologies, because the hidden ones like to use Greek mythology, which was taken from Egypt. And here's one quick example I give you. So the source of this article is Ancient Egypt Online, and it says Ra created himself from the primordial chaos. He is also known as Re and Atum. His children are Shu, the god of dry air, and the father of the sky, and his twin sister Tefnut, the goddess of moisture and wetness. As a lion-headed goddess, Tefnut is responsible for dew and freshness. Humans were created from Ra's tears. So Ra created himself from chaos, and as you can see, this family tree is born from chaos. So if Greek mythology is speaking of chaos, and Egypt texts are speaking of chaos, what do you think the chances are that you'll find symbolism in the Bible that has to do with chaos? Keep that in mind. All right, so again, take note of what you see here. You have the Titans, you have the sea gods. All right, take note. I took the liberty in deciphering the meanings for you. And as mentioned before, Chronos has to do with time. And as you start to plug in what these names mean, you can see a bigger story. It all has to do with the sky and aspects of the sky and the human experience. All right, here's some more. Take a look at the 9 muses. And as you can see, Zeus represents the sky and water. So I can easily tell you, hey, did you know Zeus was black? But debating the race of a fictional character wouldn't be conducive to evolutionary growth. This goes for the Bible as well. Keep that in mind. However, if the topic of discussion is the origin of the indigenous Greek people, then you might be surprised with the answers that you actually find. But spoiler alert, they were melanated. Alright, so we went over Black Greeks, and as mentioned before, this entire order was born from chaos. And again, take note of the names. You have Gaia Uranus, Gaia Tartarus, Gaia Pontus, Ether, Erebus, Chaos. Just make a mental note. So now let's look more into the creation story so we can find some similarities and do a little bit of deciphering. So this article comes from GreekMythology.com. In the beginning, there was only chaos, the gaping emptiness. Then, either all by themselves or out of the formless void, sprang forth three primordial deities: Gaia, or earth, Tartarus, or the underworld, and Eros, love. Once love was there, Gaia and Chaos, two female deities, were able to procreate and shape everything known and unknown in the universe. Also known as pre-creation and procreation, just keep that in mind. The children of Chaos and Gaia, Erebus and Nyx. And I'm going to read it to you because it's important. Gaia gave birth to Erebus, darkness, and Nyx, night. Erebus slept with his sister Nyx, and out of this union came Ether. So that's darkness slept with night, and then out of that union came Ether. Out of this union came Ether, the bright upper air, and Hemera, the day, emerged. Afterward, feared by everyone but her brother, Night fashioned a family of haunting forces all by herself. Among others, her children included the hateful Morris, or Fate, the Black Cur, or Doom, the Natos, Death, Hypnos, Sleep, Oneiroi, Dreams, Geas, Old Age, Voices, Pain, Nemesis, Revenge, Iris, Strife, Apate, Deceit, Philotes, Sexual Pleasure, Momos, Blame, and the Hesperides, the Daughters of the Evening, Gaia and Uranus. Meanwhile, Gaia gave birth to Uranus, the starry sky, or heaven. Uranus became Gaia's husband, surrounding her from all sides. Together they produced three sets of children: the three one-eyed Cyclops, the 300-headed Hecaton Shiris, and the 12 Titans. And as a reminder, the 12 Titans are time, fertility, water or oceans, light, intellects, constellations, mortality, memory and remembrance, law and order, intellect and the moon, sight, and fresh waters. So as you can see, deciphering the names, they're actually symbolic for other things, like aspects of the heaven and the human experience, or the human consciousness. Now, this part, the castration of Uranus, I believe to be very important, and it's going to sound very similar to the story of Noah and his 3 sons in the ark. However, Uranus was a cruel husband and even crueler father. He hated his children and didn't want to allow them to see the light of day. So, he imprisoned them into the hidden places of the earth, Gaia's womb. This angered Gaia, and she plotted with her sons against Uranus. She made a harp, a great adamant sickle, and tried to incite her children to attack Uranus. All were too afraid except the youngest, Titan. Now, I don't want this point to be lost upon you, so let me reiterate a bit. Uranus made a harp, a great adamant sickle, and tried to incite her children to attack Uranus, aka Heaven. All were too afraid except the youngest Titan, Kronos, aka Time. So Gaia, the Earth, wanted Time to attack the heavens with an adamant sickle. Alright, so a sickle, an agricultural implement consisting of a curved metal blade with a short handle fitted on a tang. You can also see that it is derived from the Latin secula, sickle, from secere, to cut. Alright, so Earth wanted Time to cut heaven. Gaia and Kronos set up an ambush for Uranus. As he was preparing to lay with Gaia, Kronos castrated him with the sickle, throwing his severed genitals into the ocean. Very important key, remember the part I just read to you. So Uranus was getting ready to lay down with Gaia and Kronos castrated him with the sickle. In other words, he saw his father's nakedness. Now this comes from evidenceunseen.com for the source. Did Ham take advantage of Noah? Noah drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. He said, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." Does that sound familiar? If not, let's continue. Kronos became the next ruler, and he imprisoned Cyclops and the Hecaton Cheres in Tartarus. and set the dragoness Campe to guard them. It goes on to say that it was prophesied that Kronos would be overthrown by one of his children, so he started to eat his children, devouring each of them at the time of birth. Remember, symbolism. Kronos eating his children at the time of birth. So you'll often see Kronos depicted with children. Here's another, him devouring children. However, upon analyzing this, something stood out to me. It's not the literal act of Kronos eating children, but it's the act of time eating children. The moment you incarnate, you're getting older and older by the minute, by the day, by the hour, by the week, by the month, and that all has to do with time. Time is literally eating you, eating us. You start as a baby, and then you go out through the ages until you're in old age and right before you hit death. Time is eating you. So that's what Kronos is symbolic for. All right, moving on. So here's more. This is about Zeus, if you want to pause to read about that. It talks about how Zeus plotted to defeat Kronos and disguise himself as wisdom for Kronos to drink. Because the older you get, the wiser you become. It's symbolic. All right, so we left off discussing the symbolism with Kronos devouring his children. And again, the reference to Kronos eating his children is just symbolic for time eating away at you the moment that you're conceived. And again, Zeus disguised himself as wisdom and Kronos drank it, which means you get wiser as you get older. This is one reason why you'll watch The Lion King when you're like 6 or 7 years old and you're like, oh, this is a great story about lions. And then when you're 30, you'll watch The Lion King and you'll say, oh, this is the exact same story that's told in religious text over and over and over again. Because as time goes by, you become wiser. Okay, so moving right along, I'm trying to get through this, but at the same time, I'm making sure that you guys understand what's being said. So I'm not moving as fast as I usually do, because some of you asked me to slow it down just a bit. But if you haven't watched the previous lecture, this lecture is more for the advanced students. So just try to keep up. Okay, so here you see Kronos was still in charge, but he was too old to defend himself against the attack, so he enlisted the help of the faithful Titans. And again, take a note of the 12 Titans and their symbolic meaning. Now for the Olympians, you have destruction, sky and weather, revenge, the sea, underworld, agriculture, forethought, afterthought, strength, violent anger, time, and fate. So this God versus Titans is literally the coming together of creation to make you, to make this existence. Agriculture, forethought, afterthought, sight, fertility, time, those are all aspects of this simulation. I don't want y'all to get lost, so I'll just say those are aspects of its reality, the world that you see around you. So it goes on to speak of the war that went on between the Titans and Olympians and how it was remembered by generations. It will always be remembered because it's our reality right now. And it says, Atlas became the Titans' leader and led his armies to many victories. And we spoke in detail about Atlas in previous lectures. At one point, it even seemed that Zeus would be defeated. However, at the advice of Gaia, he went to Tartarus and released the Cyclops and the Hecatocheres. In gratitude, the Cyclops provided Zeus with his signature thunderbolt. They also made a trident for Poseidon and a helmet of visibility for Hades. Zeus represents the sky and the weather. Gaia represents earth. Tartarus the underworld. The Cyclops gave Zeus, sky and weather, his thunderbolt. Poseidon represents the sea. And Hades is also the underworld. Now when you see Tartarus in the underworld, think inner earth. And on a mental low, think the lower stages of consciousness. So Tartarus and Hades, one represents the earth, one represents consciousness. Okay, moving on to Tartarus and Atlas. If you're caught up on the lectures, this next part is going to be very familiar. So a quick note before moving on. Newcomers, I am so grateful and appreciative for you. I know that you all come with thoughts and opinions formed by your own lived experience, as we all do. Having a difference of opinion from me, disagreeing with me is welcomed. And by all means, you are right to you based on your own lived experience. But disagreeing is not synonymous with being disrespectful or being mean. But your response is your karma and the fate that you have chosen. But don't leave any negative comments because 1, the students here will come for you, and 2, I'll block you. So just be cool. Alright, so moving on. Zeus exiled the Titans who had fought against him into Tartarus. He made an exception with Atlas, though, being the leader of the opposing force, he was punished to hold the universe on his shoulders. Here's an Atlas statue in New York for a modern day reference, and of course the Atlas project from CERN. Now here's the etymology of Atlas, a titan who is supposed to uphold the pillars of heaven or earth. The Greek name traditionally is interpreted as the bearer of the heavens, or as we went over before, a collection of maps in a volume. Hopefully now you see why the old lectures were done in the order they were done in. Also, Atlantean is resembling or pertaining to Atlas, as we mentioned before. The final challenge, Zeus and Typhon. Zeus's power would be challenged on a few occasions afterward. Just after Titanomachy, his grandmother Gaia, outraged by the imprisonment of her children, issued forth one last child of her, the monstrous Typhon. Now Zeus, the sky and the weather, was able to defeat Typhon. Typhon is very similar to typhoon, a mature tropical cyclone that develops 180 to 100 degrees east in the northern hemisphere. Almost similar to a great flood, because it's all symbolic, which means if this is symbolic and this was taken from Egyptian text, and if this was taken from Egyptian text, what I'm conveying is, if this was also taken from Egyptian text, okay, remember the similarities, make a note of them. So then, essentially, if all of these three religious figures have identical stories and the only thing that is separating them is a name, that would mean they are symbolic for something else, like different stages of consciousness, the Christ consciousness, the Buddha consciousness, the Krishna consciousness. You see, the Holy Bible, or Helios Biblios, the Bhagavad Gita, Greek mythology, Egyptian text, they're all speaking about the soul, the earth, and consciousness. You see, you have different chakras, different planes of existence, different realms. For example, your thought forms live in the mental realm. When you dream, you go to the astral realm. And you have different bodies for different realms. Like in the third dimension, you're using your physical body. So continuing with the different bodies. The etheric body, or the ether body, is the name given by neo-theosophy to the subtle body propounded in esoteric philosophy as the first or lowest layer in the human energy field or aura. The etheric body is said to be in immediate contact with the physical body and to sustain it and connect it with higher bodies. It is also said to consist of a finer substance, more pure and composed of smaller particles than the ordinary matter of the physical plane. Now quickly to break this down, your body is composed of matter, or what we call matter, but is really just vibrating energy, vibrating particles. Those particles are the particles that would be found here in this third dimension physical plane. When you go to other realms of existence, you have other particles, like in the fourth dimension where you would use your subtle body. And those particles are actively being discovered to enter or find another dimension. For example, in the etheric realm, you would use your ethereal body or your ether body. And those particles would be more pure and smaller. So therefore, it wouldn't be the same particles found in this physical plane, so you wouldn't have a physical body. It would be a completely different body because the particles create the reality. Just like here, we deal with protons and electrons and neutrons. But at the core of those particles, you just find vibrations. So every different realm you go to, you just have to find out how to vibrate at the rate that their reality is vibrating. Here's an example of what your different bodies would look like. So I had to cover that part before moving on, but we'll come back to that in another lecture. So now that we've covered Greek mythology, or a bit of it, let's move on to the ancient Egyptian creation story, so we can find the similarities between the Greek mythology and the Bible. And we've been doing that as we've been moving along. So as mentioned before, the ancient Egyptian creation story is one of the oldest known to us, predating the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, codified maybe circa 650 BCE, by more than 2,000 years. There are certain similarities, though important distinctions, also between the traditions of Mesopotamia, which are ancestral to the biblical narrative, and those of Egypt. And let me just say this before moving on. When you enter the astral realm, aka a dream, do you ever worry about the beginning of the dream, or do you identify with what's presently happening? Well, the same can be said for the simulation. Let that marinate. Okay, the story from Hermopolis features a group of 8 gods known collectively as the Ogdod, who were born in the primeval waters. They represented chaos. So real quick, if you want to know more about the different bodies, etheric bodies, subtle body, astral body, here's a great book by Linda Perry called Flower Essences. It teaches you about the different bodies and tells you how to use floral essences to take care of those bodies. Someone made a note that I only source internet articles instead of books. And for anybody else who may have that thought, essentially my life is dedicated to research. I spend a ridiculous amount of time on research. My sources come from old magazines, old newspaper articles, books, scholar articles online, peer-reviewed articles, essentially any source that carries the truth. And what makes that source credible is not a book, because the only difference between a book and the internet is the medium being used for your writing. But is the information accurate, and can it be disproven, debunked? I'm all about the truth, transparency, and integrity. The divine flows through me. Moving on. Back to this article, some interesting parallels. In Genesis 1:1, the word for beginning literally means head. In Egyptian hieroglyphs, the symbol used to describe the beginning of time is that of a man's head. Genesis 1:2 discusses 4 phenomena. Similar concepts appear in Egyptian creation stories in the form of gods. These are outlined in the table below. So it just shows you juxtapose what's said in the Bible and then what's said in the Egyptian creation stories. You have formlessness, confusion, chaos, emptiness is Heru, is formless and void. Then you have extreme and darkness. Then you have Keku, the darkness. Deep sea in the Bible is known in the Egyptian creation story. Breath, wind, and spirit in the Bible is Amun, wind, breath of God in Egyptian creation story. On day 2 of creation, God formed the firmament. The Hebrew word for firmament is related to a word which means beat, stamp, or spread out, like an arc. Meanwhile, 2 common Egyptian words for creation derive from the word meaning hammer out from metal. Creation by word and act. Because in the beginning there was the word, and the word was God. Remember that. That's what's said in the Bible. Those aren't my words. Just as God created the universe by speaking it into being, Egyptian mythology contains that life was created according to the word of a god. One inscription records that Atum created animal life by commanding it to be, and another describes Ta thinking and so creating. This stands in contrast to the Babylonian myths in which creation by word does not appear. Genesis 1:6-8 describes God separating waters from the waters with the firmament between. This is similar to the Egyptian inscription which describes the heavens being separated from the primeval waters and from the earth. Alright, so check out the similarities here. It's similarities between the Hermopolis creation story and the Genesis creation account. It's identical. Keep Noah's Ark in mind when reading this. One of the most notable Babylonian flood stories is the Gilgamesh epic. So we left off talking about one of the most notable Babylonian flood stories is the Gilgamesh epic, which the book of Genesis is often compared to. And you can see the Gilgamesh epic features a flood story named Ut-Nabishtim. While Babylonian has many flood stories, Egypt has none, which seems surprising since flooding was a common occurrence in Egypt. Now, let me pause you right there. When you think about floods in the United States, what's the first state that pops up? Go ahead, give it some thought. Okay, because again, if we look at this map, look where Egypt is placed. And shout out to UB News for this map. If you want this map, just search Old Testament map. Now, what part of the U.S. floods the most? If you ask me, I would say it would be Louisiana, specifically the New Orleans area. And if you look at where Egypt is placed, it's around that area. Taking that into consideration, this headline would make a lot more sense now. Amateur claims to have found 12,000-year-old underwater city with pyramid and energy field off the U.S. coast, specifically Louisiana. Okay, so with that being said, this would make sense. Flooding was a common occurrence in Egypt, with the most recent flood being Hurricane Katrina. Some would say it was intentional. But I'm just going to use this for historical reference to give ancient Egypt a geographical location that fits this narrative. Okay, so moving on, you have some more symbolic meanings. Deep means Noah, rest or comfort. Wind or spirit of God means Shem, name, glory or representative. formlessness, emptiness means Japheth. Spacious, wide, open, extreme darkness, or black means Ham or black. Cox suggests that if these names are indeed parallels to the four primeval elements, then one of the aforementioned Egyptian creation accounts may be a retelling of the flood story. The 8 gods, known as the Oak Dode, consisted of 4 males and their female consorts, Nun and Nunet, Amun and Amunet, Kiku and Kikuet, and Hiru and Hiruet. The names Noah and Nun have the same meaning and speak of quiet, tranquil abiding. Noah is associated with the flood, while Nun is associated with the primeval waters. It seems likely that the Egyptian god Nun is based on a memory of biblical Noah. And just for reference, I believe that this article has it backwards because the Egyptian text predates the Bible. Just to throw that out there. The name Shem means name, representation, or glory. The word Amun, which represents the next god in the Egyptian Oak Dode, means hidden of name, heaven, or sun. This range of meaning overlaps significantly with that of Shem's name. Additionally, Amun is associated with the flood. Therefore, Amun may represent Shem. Japheth means spacious, wide open, youthful, and open-minded. Heh, the next god in the Oak Dode, has a name meaning great numbers, searching, and treading. Heh is associated with inundation water and may represent Japheth. The name Ham means hot, black, noise, or troubled. Kek, the final god in the Oak Dode, means darkness, floodwater, or twilight. These similarities suggest that Kek represents Ham. Additionally, Kek is also known as Horus. Therefore, Ham Kek equals Horus. Now we're moving on to Ham, ruler of Egypt. Egyptian history records a dynasty of long-lived kings, sometimes referred to as demigods. That's what we are, we're demigods. Could these represent the long-lived flood survivors? The Egyptian word for old age comes from the same root as the name of god Nun, whom Cox equates with Noah. Additionally, the Egyptian phonetic equivalent to the name Shem means to be old, and the Egyptian phonetic equivalent for the name Japheth means to attain old age. Finally, the Egyptian phonetic equivalent for the name Ham means grain of the hair. According to Psalms 78:51, 105:23, and 27:106-22, Egypt is the land of Ham. Recall that the name Ham can mean black. Is it a coincidence that the Egyptian hieroglyphs for Egypt refer to the country as Blackland? Additionally, the land of Egypt is figuratively referred to as Horus. Recall that Horus is the equivalent of Kek, the god that Cox equates with Ham. It seems that Ham is closely linked with the name of Egypt itself. According to Egyptian records, Horus had 4 sons, Kebiseneth, Amset, Duamothif, and Hapi. If Horus represents Ham, could these refer to the 4 sons of Ham? Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Ham would have passed the story of the flood onto his 4 sons, and they may have influenced the Egyptian language, especially in regard to flood vocabulary. Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan are all Egyptian names. The root for Cush means floodwater. The root for Mizraim means origin of the water. The root for Put means flood. And the root for Canaan means flood. And again, for clarification, when you see these names, I don't want you to think physical incarnations, but rather symbolic meanings. In the same way you call like cannabis Mary, Mary represents cannabis. Mary is not an actual person, just for an example. All right, so this article goes on to say, according to Egyptian mythology, Osiris was the father of Horus. If Horus is Ham, is Osiris Noah? Epitaphs of Osiris label him in a variety of ways. These include Osiris the long-lived, Osiris weary-hearted, Osiris the drowned one, and he who is in the box, Osiris. These all seem descriptive of Noah. He who was in the box, Noah was in the ark. Furthermore, one description links Osiris with Nun, the flood god, whom Cox associates with Noah. So now you can see the symbolism. So I'm not going to read this part. You can pause to read. This just compares the Oak Dode to Noah's Ark and their similarities. It tells you that a wall inscription shows the Oak Dode as a ship, and we know Noah's Ark to be a ship. Egyptian mythology depicts the Oak Dode as creators. Perhaps it would be better to see them as recreators. One depiction portrays the 8 gods with hoes tilling the soil. This is generally interpreted as the first acts of creation, but perhaps instead it represents Noah and his family making a new life after the flood. According to Genesis 9:20, Noah became a farmer and planted a vineyard. So again, it would be more of the Bible retelling the Egyptian story. Okay, so we've covered a bit of symbolism from the Holy Bible, aka Heliobiblios. We went over Greek mythology and the creation story, and also Egyptian texts in the creation story. So that way you have a frame of reference on how to decipher religious text. And just so that you're aware of the similarities between these different creation stories that come from different cultures, civilizations throughout different times in our history. And these creation stories often leaves the inquisitive mind to ask, what's the real story? Like, where did we come from? Because what you'll find with researching these is that one religious text is just a copy and paste of another. So in another lecture, we'll definitely have to go over the Anunnaki in full detail. But for now, we're going to fast forward. Okay, so previously we talked about Pangea. Pangea is when all of the continents were connected together. And since paper wasn't invented at that time, a lot of written history didn't exist. So instead, what you have are cave drawings, and these serves as the earliest systems of recorded history. Like this one that represents Queen Califia in California, the Griffin King. And as we move on, keep her nickname, the Griffin King, in mind. It will come in later. So besides cave drawings, something else that gives us insights on ancient times that predate written history would be these ancient mysterious walls found in California. Okay, from mysteriousuniverse.org, we have the mysterious ancient walls of California. Definitely check out this article if you want to know more about this wall. So, who were the builders of this wall, this mysterious wall? So, to retrieve our answer to that question, we're going to have to jump back in time. We're going to have to jump back to Grand Tartary. There's a note in the bottom right-hand corner, just going to tell you briefly what it says. So, Grand Tartary was split up, right? You have Mongols that were on one side with other groups, and then you have Africans. So this is why sometimes you'll have some people tell you that Tartarians were white, and then other people will tell you that Tartarians were black. Both are true. Just how in America you have different phenotypes of people who are Americans, black, white, yellow, brown, but we're all Americans. Same goes for Grand Tartary. They were all Tartarians with different colors of skin. Keep that in mind as we move along. So Grand Tartary was located at the north of Cathay, aka China, and at one point in time was the largest power nation. So what we now call China, it used to be called Cathay or Chitam, and it was right below Grand Tartary. And it is believed that this is where the Great Wall of China was constructed, to keep the Chinese out of Tartaria, and vice versa. Here's an article I found on LinkedIn called The Great Tartarian Empire by Mene Kotze. It goes on to say, they built the Great Wall in what is now China. Marco Polo wrote an extensive and detailed account of Asia in the 13th and 14th centuries and did not even mention a wall. The Great Wall is not seen in any maps predating the late 1600s. So most of its construction occurred in the 1700s, and it was built to keep the encroaching Chinese out of Tartaria. The openings on the wall are on the north sides towards the former Tartary, now on the South China facing side. It should be called the Great Wall of Tartaria. The further back in time you go, the more advanced it gets. There are many pyramids of different kinds, megalithic temples hewn out of solid rock. That last part is very important. Keep that in your mind as we go over different structures that were built here in America and how they relate to Tartarians. Now, as I mentioned before, Mongolians or Tartarians are closely related. Some people even call them the same ethnic group. But the name was changed from Tartarian to Mongolian to make it more acceptable in history and to erase the history of the Tartarians. That's what some researchers would say. But essentially, the same group, Mongolian Tartarians. So let's look at a brief history of Mongolians and Tartarians so that you can understand this. So in order to trace back the lineage of the Mongolians and Tartarians, we're briefly going to have to look at the myth or legend of Prester John. The legend of Prester John dates back to before the Crusades. The word Prester came from the Greek word presbyteros, which meant elder, as in the older wise man who ran the church. Presbyteros was the base word for Presbyterian. As you can see here, Prester John was the king of the Tartars, and he was known as the Great Khan of China and the Dragon King. Then right underneath, it tells you about the dragon flag of Tartary. The dragon is a symbol of wisdom, immortality, wealth, courage, firepower, and the Messiah. But for Tartary, you can see it as a dragon or a griffin. Alright, so here's the flag of Tartary. Alright, so keep in mind, Prester John is connected to Grand Tartary. He is known as the king of the Tartars. This was supposedly Prester John, the Grand Negus. Side note, Negus means king. It's where Niga is derived from. So Negus, Nigga means king. All right, Prester John. Here's a book about him. All right, and moving on. Another unique thing about Prester John. This part is important, so pay attention. This comes from Britannica.com. Okay, so it was reported to Rome information about a Muslim defeat by a certain King David of India, the son or grandson of Prester John. This King David probably was none other than Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan is the grandson of Prester John. So we left off talking about Prester John and Genghis Khan. Keep them in your mind as we continue. I'm going to read a bit of this article, and the original source is historytoday.com. It is certain that the Jesuit mission, which established itself at the court of the Mughal Empire Akbar at the end of the 16th century, thought that the priest king still ruled in Cathay, that mysterious land described by Marco Polo. Just in case you aren't familiar, Marco Polo was a Venetian merchant, explorer, and writer who traveled through the Asia along the Silk Road between 1271 and 1295. All right, and pause to read what the Silk Road is. All right, so then it goes on to tell you more about Prester John and how Cathay was actually China. Pause to read. The Portuguese continued to call the Negus of Abyssinia by the name of Prester John, and the rest of the world has followed suit. Remember, the title Negus means king, so that means king of Abyssinia. Side note, when you try to call somebody like a nigga, but with the ER as a derogatory term, you're actually calling them a king. So it's not an insult, it's a compliment. Just in case you're wondering. Okay, so then this article reiterates the fact that Cathay is the Chinese Empire. Caprini made a passing reference to the Black Cathayans, who he claimed were Christian in all but name. They had recently been conquered by the Mongols, but the Prester was not among these people. He had moved to the adjacent land of India Major. If one is permitted to interpret the Black Saracens, who are also called Ethiopians, as a reference to the Kara or Black Katai. In the 13th century, it is worth noting the term Ethiopia was so imprecise as not to justify its location in Africa without supporting evidence, which, in this case, it is not present. Prester John and his son David were described as kings of India to whom Mongols used to pay tribute. Then it goes on to say that Genghis Khan invaded the land of Prester John. Make sure you read this last paragraph because it's very important. So let's make a connection from ancient times to modern times. This fluid definition of Uyghur and the diverse ancestry of modern Uyghurs create confusion as to what constitutes true Uyghur ethnography and ethnogenesis. Contemporary scholars consider modern Uyghurs to be the descendants of a number of peoples, including the ancient Uyghurs of Mongolia. Let's stop there. Okay, so this is currently happening in 2022. Who are the Uyghurs and why is China being accused of genocide? So the battle that started in ancient times is still reflecting in modern times. Here are the Uyghurs in a detention camp in China. The Uyghurs in China now live in a giant open-air prison camp. Turkey calls out China's Uyghur detention camps, urging closure. Now, Turkey plays a major role in this because the Uyghurs are a Turkic ethnic group originating from culturally affiliated with the general region of Central and East Asia. All right, so this is coming from Britannica.com. Okay, so again, Britannica says King David of India, the son or grandson of Prester John, had mobilized his armies against the Saracens. Then the last sentence to reiterate, King David, as it turned out, was the Tigris Mongol ruler Genghis Khan, making a connection between Prester John and Genghis Khan. And it has been said countless times that Prester John was black in phenotype. And that means if he was related to Genghis Khan, here is a shrine of Genghis Khan. I'm just going to leave that with you. After the mid-14th century, Ethiopia became the center of search for the kingdom of Prester John, who was identified with the Negus, or emperor, of that African Christian nation. The legend, however, locates Prester John in Asia, especially in Nestorian areas. Something important to keep in mind as we continue. Now here's an article that comes from an everyday person like you and me, but it's great information. And you can find it on Quora. There's his screen name. At the bottom here it says the name Tartar is later applied by the Christian Europeans to describe the Turco-Mongol people of the Golden Horde, who they believe to have spawned from the depths of the Greek underworld Tartarus. Interesting. What does the Bible say about Tartarus? Tartarus off of jw.org. In the Christian Greek scriptures, a prison-like abased condition into which the disobedient angels of Noah's days were cast. Now, in this instance, it says does not signify that the angels who sinned were cast into the pagan mythological Tartarus. Rather, it indicates that they were abased by God from their heavenly place and privileges and were delivered over to a condition of deepest mental darkness respecting God's bright purposes. Save this note to the end, but it says deepest mental darkness. Keep that in mind, literally. Now, looking at an ancient map of Tartaria, you see this word Scythia. Could it be relation to the Scythia that was mentioned in the Bible? Okay, Scythians. Pause to read. Tells you who they are and what they were about. I want you to remember that they were a nomadic and barbaric people. Alright, so if you read the previous part, follow me down to here. Eventually, they were defeated and destroyed by the Medes, who expelled the remnants of them to the north under the name Ashkenaz. The Scythians are said to be one of the sons of Gomer, Cimmerians, along with the Riphath and Togomar. Gomer, in turn, was one of the sons of Japheth. The biblical writers view the Scythians as a savage and cruel people. The memory of them persisted in the Holy Land and the popular Greek name of the city of Bethshan or Scythopolis. So this article comes from Edwin Yamauchi. The Scythians, who were they and why did Paul include them in Colossians 3:11? All right, let's look at this breakdown. Colossians 3:11. All right, so Scythians in the Bible. So it just breaks down different meaning of the word. Barbarian, savage, alien, uncivilized, uncouth, foreigner. Okay, so it says in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word Ashkenaz occurs in Genesis 10:3 and its parallel 1 Chronicles 1:6 and in Jeremiah 51:7. The word has been identified with the Akkadian, i.e. Babylonian, word Ashkuza for the Scythians. So this is saying a parallel for the word Scythians is Ashkenaz, as in Ashkenazi, Jews. So at the bottom here, it says you can refer back to cuneiform sources that talks about the invasion of the Cimmerians and the Scythians in the 8th through the 7th centuries BC along Assyria's northern frontier. For those who aren't familiar, this is what cuneiform looks like. Just to jump back for a second and reiterate Jasher 10:7. And these are the sons of Japheth according to their families, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Havan, Tubal, Meshes, and Taraz. But as stated earlier, just keep in mind Magog and Gomer. Remember, Japheth is symbolic for the purposes of this lecture because the real origin of man has to do with DNA manipulation, but that's not for this lecture. We're just doing some tracing back so we can set up for that lecture. Okay, so it's from these sons that we can deduce white Europeans or Caucasians originate. So if that's you, you're likely to be one of the Gentile nations, which meaning if you're Ashkenaz, you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. Okay, now we have figured out the Scythians are the parallel to the Ashkenaz. You can see the connection that makes them the same group. Okay, so the Ashkenaz were viewed as barbaric and savage. Keep that in mind as we continue. Okay, so this part is important, so please pay attention. It's a little bit of reading, but it's important. All right, so this is that same article from the Trumpet we were reading earlier, but now we're going to skip down to another part. Handling the Han. The history of the Han Chinese is much less obscure. In fact, the Han people record their history all the way back to the time of the Tower of Babel. Then it goes on to tell you about the Shu King and the Great Flood. Read it. Ancient Chinese records speak of China's first emperors, Yao, Shun, and Yu. One such record, the Shu King, explains that one of Yao's tasks was to deal with the effects of a great flood that ravaged the land. During Yao's lifetime, a new leader, Shun, came to power. According to another ancient Chinese manuscript, the Bamboo Annals, Shun is described as having a black body. He was obviously not Chinese, and his mother was called the Queen Mother of the West, indicating him as a foreigner. The Shu King gives the name of Shun's father as Kusaw. According to Dr. Herman Ho's Compendium of World History, this Shun was none other than the Nimrod of the Bible. Therefore, Kuso, which can also be spelled Kuso, is Nimrod's father, Cush. Pause to read what Britannica.com has to say about Nimrod for those of you who aren't familiar. So we left off talking about Nimrod. Nimrod is a legendary biblical figure of the book Genesis. Nimrod is described in Genesis 10:8 through 12 as the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. It also says that Assyria is called the land of Nimrod. There is some consensus among biblical scholars that the mention of Nimrod in Genesis is a reference to not an individual but to an ancient people in Mesopotamia. The description of Nimrod as a mighty hunter before the Lord is an intrusion in this context, but probably like the historical notices derived from some old Babylonian saga. However, no equivalent of the name has been found in the Babylonian or other cuneiform records. In character, there is certain resemblance between Nimrod and the Mesopotamian epic hero Gilgamesh. Keep that in mind as we continue. And just in case you're unfamiliar with Gilgamesh, coming from Britannica.com, Gilgamesh, the best known of all ancient Mesopotamian heroes. You can pause to read what it says. Here's an artifact depicting Gilgamesh. I just wanted to point out that Gilgamesh looks similar to this Anunnaki giant. Matter of fact, they look identical. Alright, so take a look at him. Now look at Gilgamesh. Side note, keep this in mind for another lecture when we cover the Anunnaki. Take a look at his wrist. Even though this is an ancient artifact, it looks like he's wearing a modern watch. Alright, so I want to bring your attention to something. Look at the animal the man is holding in the statue, and look at the man that's looking up at the statue. Alright, the man that's looking up at the statue is regular size that you would see today. The statue is a giant. He's holding a lion. If you don't have this book, I would like for you to get this book that speaks about the Nephilim. But just keep in mind for now that the Nephilim are giants that existed in the days of Noah and is present in this book of Enoch. And for a quick reference, here are some Bible verses about the Nephilim, appearing in the first book of Genesis. There were giants in earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Just something to keep in the back of your mind. Why were the Nephilim described as the sons of God? And they were giants, just like the symbolic Nimrod, or the Anunnaki. Are the Anunnaki also seen as sons of the Creator? Something to keep in mind. Before moving on, I want you to read this short part about the history after the flood. It tells you about the first cities. The first cities had their king Nimrod. From these came Asher, from whom the Assyrians received their name. So remember Asher. Alright, but it says the first city was Babylon. Okay, now let's come back to this article from the Trumpet. Now let's go over this again briefly. Now it should make more sense. A brief history of a great people. The Chinese people comprise one dominant ethnic group and many small minorities. The ethnic Han comprise more than 90% of the 1.3 billion people living in China. Though minority ethnic groups such as the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongols, and Manchu make up a small percentage of the Chinese population, in absolute numbers they are still large populations. And again, it says that there are more Mongols living in China than in Mongolia. Again, the Bible deals primarily with Israel. And Magog's sons, they moved to an area that was independent of those civilizations developing in the Middle East. So therefore, no sons of Magog are listed in scripture. So tracing the sons of Magog gets hazy. However, Jewish historian Josephus indicated where Magog's descendants settled. He wrote, in the 1st century, Magog founded those that from him were named Magogites, but who are by the Greeks called Scythians. The descendants of Magogs are the Scythians. The savages, the barbarians, the uncouth people. And remember, the Scythians are parallel to the Ashkenaz. And again, looking back at this history of symbolic people, you can see that Ashkenaz is a son of Gomer, who is the son of Japheth, and Magog is the son of Japheth. Soon after the dispersion of the Tower of Babel, Japheth's descendants migrated through Central Asia to the lands they occupy now. One of the 7 sons of Japheth bears special importance to the prophetic identity of the Chinese and even their nomadic neighbors. That is Magog, the 2nd son of Japheth mentioned in Genesis 10:2. So it's necessary to connect some dots before we move on to the conclusion of this lecture. In a prophecy in Ezekiel 38, the Bible labels the vast territory of the northern Eurasia where the Scyths live, a region that stretched from Russian steppes east into the modern-day China and Mongolia, as Magog. This territory contained many different tribes of people of white and yellow races, all of whom were called Scyths or Scythians by the Greeks. The people who most prominently settled this land are typically identified as Mongolic and Turkic. And just to reiterate, Mongol is a derivative of Magog. Here's a map of the Mongol Empire, 1294 AD. Take note as to where Moscow is. Take a note where Tibet is. Here's another map. All right, keep this in mind. Here's another map. You can see Mongolia between Russia and China. Now take note, you have Kazakhstan right next to Mongolia. So in modern times, here's somebody from Kazakhstan. She looks Asian, but she speaks Russian. This comes from the Mongolian Empire, also known as Tartaria. Because remember, Mongols, Tartars, same people. And remember, the Scythians migrated through China. I would say that some of them ended up in Germany. Again, who are the Ashkenazi Jews? Well, this article says they originated in medieval Germany, written by a rabbi. Okay, so I just want to show you on a map where Turkey is located. It's right next to Russia. Turkic people migrated here. Also next to Ukraine. This ancient history of this land is a story about different Turkic and Mongolic tribes vying for control of the area. Alright, today the land the Bible calls Magog is dominated in the west by Russia, which is reasserting control over the region once possessed through the USSR, and China in the east. Something else I would like to reiterate. One pious member of the Scotch Kirk derives the Japanese from the lost tribes of Israel. The two greatest authorities on the subject, Bells and Rain, say purely and simply that the Japanese are Mongols. Keep this in mind, we're going to come back to this in a second. It is historically certain that some Mongols have come over and settled in Japan, namely Koreans and Chinamen at various epochs of authentic Japanese history. The battles of Toba and Fushimi, in which the Jewish imperial forces defeated the army of Shogunate, were the Battle of Gog and Magog, heralding the redemption of the Jewish people and the revelation of the 10 lost tribes. Again, here's some scrolls from 1840 depicting the Japanese as melanated, closer to brown and black in phenotype. Alright, so here is Tartaria as is depicted on an ancient map. As you can see, it used to be where China is now. Take a look at where China is. Right next to it, you have North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. Keep this in mind, this is very important. Okay, so we've established the Tartarians and Mongolians are the same group. So how did the Tartarians make it over to North America? And did they blend in with the indigenous peoples that were already here? For clarification, here's a depiction of ancient Americans, the indigenous Americans. One more time, let me take you back to an ancient depiction of some Mongolian peoples, because Grand Tartary also had melanated peoples. Here's a painted silk scroll that depicts a black-skinned wisdom king, Japan, 1200 AD. And remember, Mongols are Japanese. And one more, here's Aboriginal Chinese women, first people of China. Keep this in mind. Here is an old depiction of a Tartarian. Above his head, you can see it says Tartar. Tartarians could also be the ambiguous builders of a lot of ancient structures here in America. Here's a structure in Kazakhstan. And as a reminder, some Tartarians ended up in Kazakhstan. Now take notice of this architecture. Here's the Griffith Observatory in California. If you haven't been here, go check it out, it's beautiful. Now I would definitely say this design was inspired by Tartarian architecture. Tartarian architecture in Denver, Colorado. I believe this one is in St. Louis. You might see these random arcs in your city, like New York. Here's an old one in Detroit, our Capitol building, even the White House. But here's the question. How did the Tartarians get here? Can we trace their migration? And is there any other proof that they were here? Stay tuned as we finish out this lecture. Okay, so we're going to add some sources. First, we have a history of the Mongols of Central Asia. And there's the author for you. Alright, so it says, under Akbar, when the empire had become a firm result of successful war, the word Mongol recovered its prestige, and like the name Goth in Spain, came to indicate a noble conqueror or the descendant of one. And here's the citation for that. And pause to see what Turkestan is. So what it's saying in this book is that a Turk is somebody from Turkestan, but it's of Mongolian descent. So it's just a Mongolian in a different city. Okay, so now we're going to move on to this book, The Mongols. And there's the author. Okay, so pause to read this first page. Alright, so going back to what was said about the Great Wall of China, if the Mongols had felt a certain affinity with their nomad neighbors in a common lifestyle, which no doubt helped cement alliances, their relations with the nations of the South were historically those of confrontation, symbolized and realized by the Great Wall of China. So there's a confirmation. And I'm just tying up some loose ends before drawing to a grand conclusion. And I think an important note, just in case you didn't know, unlike Genghis Khan's predecessor, Attila the Hun, his great emperor did not die with him. as mentioned before, the Mongols and the Huns come from the same camp. Okay, so here's what it says about the Tartars of Mongoloid descent. In appearance, the Tartars are quite different from all other men, for they are broader than other people between the eyes and across the cheekbones. Pause to read the rest. But then later refers to the Tartars and the Mongols of the same people, proving that they are interchangeable. Okay, so I'm seeing the same consistencies in these old depictions of the Mongols. You have some that are lighter skin and then some that are darker complexion. Okay, let me reconfirm. Turks do come from Turkey. So here's the chronology of the Mongols from 1162 all the way to 1526. And this is from the book Genghis Khan, The Rise, Authority, and Decline of Mongol Power, Peter Brandt. Turn your phone sideways to check out this old map of the Mongolian Empire. And this is from the book A Lost Civilization, The Mongols Rediscovered. Alright, so for an accurate description of Genghis Khan, pause to read right here. Okay, and here's another description of Genghis Khan. A man of tall stature, of vigorous build, robust in body, the hair on his face scanty and turned white, with cat's eyes, possessed of great energy, discernment, genius, and understanding. Read the rest. And this is from The Lost Country, Mongolia Revealed by Jasper Becker. Okay, so that's two different sources describing the identity of Genghis Khan. Alright, so I found something interesting in this book, To the Back of Beyond by Fitzroy McLean. Alright, so it's just this one page. Just pause to read. Talks about how Outer Mongolia and Inner Mongolia was eaten by China. They made an attempt to join the United Nations. Okay, so something I would like for you to keep in mind as we prepare to close out. I've spoke about this numerous times, especially in Exit the Matrix, The Sims. The center here, the magnetic North Pole, is known by many names. Eden, Meru, Hyperborea. Now, notice on this map that Atlantis is actually right next to Hyperborea, and then Scythia is right next to it as well. So take note, bordering the center, the magnetic North Pole, you have Canada, Asia, Russia, Europe, Greenland. Side note, check out the weather for Greenland and the strange occurrences that happen there as far as like supernatural phenomena. Pretty interesting, you might have to tap back into that. So a lot of the supernatural phenomena that take place in and around the magnetic North Pole spawn from the center, and it affects the surrounding countries. For example, in some places like Sweden or Upper Canada or Alaska, you have twilight, or you might have a certain number of days where you get sunlight without having any darkness. Keep that in mind as we continue. So as mentioned before, there was a time where all of the continents were together. That was known as Pangea. So you had original peoples on every continent when they broke apart. So therefore, you had people on North America, you had people in Africa. So with that being said, keep in mind that when Tartarians arrived here, there were already people here. Like the ancient Egyptians, our ancestors, who were already here, that were responsible for the mounds that you can find in Alabama and Mississippi. As mentioned in the Our Real Identity lecture that precedes this one. If you didn't catch that lecture, I'm telling you now. And that's why I believe this Old Testament map to have some truth to it. So you can see the architecture and how the indigenous Americans built their structures, which are completely different from these pyramids found over in modern day Egypt. That's important to note. So then, how did Tartarians migrate to North America? So real quick, let me take you back to a snapshot of this map that says Tartaria, Olam, Scythia. Olam, that's Latin. And Aliyah is redirected from Olam. It means immigration. Immigration by Jews into Israel or into Palestine before the founding of the State of Israel. Or two, any of the historical waves of such immigration. So this is potentially referring to the immigration of the Scythians into Tartaria, or through Tartaria to what is now known as Israel. You can see in the 1700s, European cartographers stopped using the term Tartary, mainly done by Jesuit scientists. Now here's a part of Tartaria. Let's look at the names of some of these areas. Danarum, Neftalitari, and notice to the right, Azarath. Now following the line of Shem, you can see that two of his descendants are Dan and Naphtali, and Asher like Azarath. You can find other cities to match other names. Now looking back at this map where it says Naphtali, it talks about 10 tribes. So coming back to this map, look at the distance between Tartaria and America. The travel begins. So we left off talking about the migration of the Tartarians. Alright, so again, here's an image of a Tartarian just to give you an idea of how they traveled by horseback. I would like to add that the Tartarians back then were living in a different world that we were living in. This book shows that some of the animals were twice as big. And this could be due to taller trees, which would have in turn helped the animals to grow larger, which is why you take a snake out of a smaller cage and put it in a bigger cage. It will grow bigger because the animal grows as big as their environment. Here's another ancient map that has some noteworthy illustrations. Take a look at how America is depicted back then. The American colors were already established. You can see on the top left with this map of America, it does mention Tartaria. Alright, and this map mentions Tartaria in the top left, and you can see the distance from America to what was then Tartaria. Alright, and in the bottom right here, you can see Japan, which is on the way, a bit out of the way, but on the way to America, serving as a stop along the way. So now this passage about Japan and its connection to the Jewish community makes more sense. And their first stop here would have been in California, where they could have constructed this wall to keep out the Chinese, who could have been following them. Because remember, the reason for the Great Wall of China was to divide them. So here you have a wall in California. So this is why I believe that the Tartarians that migrated to the Americas were melanated. So as mentioned, they have a griffin on their flag. And according to these ancient maps, that's not far-fetched. They had some pretty exotic animals back then. Take notice, the flying fish, a merman looking guy. I believe this was reflecting real life. All right, and one more. Take a look at how they drew the tree here. That's a very large, noticeable tree to put on a map. Side note, the bottom left, you have Patagonias. There's a modern day reference to that, Patagonias. So with exotic animals and large trees, a griffin is not far-fetched. Here's a griffin in the Vatican. Half lion, half bird, it looks like. Here's one in Rome. Now, Queen Calafia of California was known as the Griffin Queen. Queen Calafia, look at the great seal of the island of California. Yes, it says island. All respect is due. And it was way different than you could imagine. This is still in California today. So next time you're watching Game of Thrones, just know that the Dragon Queen comes from Queen Calafia, the Griffin Queen. Here's Tartarian architecture that still exists in California today. So they arrived and they got to work. And their architecture can still be seen today. Take another look at our White House. But the original White House was destroyed. Before we get to that, let's hit the brakes and talk about something else that's connected. So this article comes from allocation.com, David Ingram's epic walk across a continent. Okay, so it talks about this explorer, David Ingram, who wanted to explore North America. Ingram described a continent full of largely urbanized Indian tribes living in densely populated city-states. So David Ingram, he described rich Indian potentates and marvelous cities. This in itself was at odds with Europe's view of North America as being sparsely populated and inhabited by backward tribes. But it was Ingram's account of the chief of these cities called Norumbega, which fascinated other explorers in search of riches, but eventually led Ingram being written off as a quack by most people, though not before much effort was put into locating Norumbega. According to Ingram, Norumbega was an incredibly wealthy city located in what is now New England, probably in Massachusetts. He describes it as follows. The men were draped in gold and silver. So were the women. He described architectural marvels such as columns made of crystal and buildings inlaid with gold and silver. So he made it a point to note the architecture, okay? Alright, so pause to read the rest. But if you look at old maps, you can see it right there, Norumbega. Here's a completely different map. You can see Norumbega. But on this map, it also mentions Virginia, which means it was in close proximity. Let's look back to this building in St. Louis. Are those columns in front? And our White House has columns in front. Matter of fact, look at this architecture found around the world. Okay. Keep our Capitol building in mind. Now, still in Mass, you have Norumbega Park. Here's an ancient amphitheater near Bird's Pond, Belmont. Now here's Norumbega architecture in Maine. Now if you're from the north or the Midwest, Northeast, you've seen this architecture. Now to most, the builders of these are ambiguous. They look like nothing that you will find in modern day America. Matter of fact, just do a quick search for American homes. They looked really unseasoned, bland. The house can't even move, but you know it don't got no rhythm. But still left over today in places like Maine, you have remnants of Tartarian architecture. Norumbega architecture. All right, just take a good look, make note. Here's a building in downtown Detroit paying homage to that design. This was built in 1899, the Grand Army of the Republic's building. Then you have this open air theater, Norumbega Park in Mass. You can find these homes all around Detroit, and Boston, and Chicago, and New York. Looks like a regular house in a D. Very distinctive architecture. Matter of fact, I was on the bus the other day and I snapped this photo in Detroit. Norumbega style. Here's some more of that ancient architecture in California. Take note of this architecture. Do you know how long it would take modern day builders and construction workers to replicate this? Do you know the tools that were available to the civilizations that built this? I mean, really, pause this video, take a second, really think about it. Bruh, look. All right, take note of these structures. The middle one looks like a church. Keep that in mind. Immaculate. So this leaves an inquisitive mind pondering what happened. That brings us to the mud flood. Okay, so the mud flood can be viewed as a type of reset, a great reset, where many different civilizations and society as a whole was reset. Architecture destroyed, statues and monuments destroyed, essentially history destroyed. It's lost history. So we're gonna pause here and look at some examples before moving on. So again, here's one of the remnants of a predecessor civilization that was here. I know sometimes people equate ancient civilizations with having less than, but a lot of them were more advanced than we are in spirituality and the type of technology they had. Okay, so there are a lot of buildings in North America that look like this. They have a bottom part that's nearly forgotten, like something buried it, and then they just built on top of it. This is the result of a flood. Here's another. To construct a building like this makes no logical sense. This will require more effort from the builders. You may have seen a building in your city that looks just like this. You have like a bottom window that's cut off. Matter of fact, I grew up in a home like this. Now this is in Iowa. Look at the structure. Now remember the structures I've shown you before. Again, this is in Iowa, and quite frankly, it looks kind of out of place. Now when you see this, you can tell obviously there are columns that were buried. This is the remains of a large structure, a large building, and the remains are underground, signifying that there was a flood that happened that buried these. Seeing this photo, you'll probably think this is in like Greece. This was Chicago in the middle to late 1800s. But in 1849, there was a great flood of Chicago. And in 1871, there was a great Chicago fire, destroying more than 17,000 structures. It left more than 100,000 residents homeless. And there was a great flood in 1849 in Mississippi due to levee failure. Where have we heard that before? So again, photos like these serve as proof that there was definitely a mud flood. Undeniably so. North America used to be a completely different place. How can you deny something like this that was buried? Even our capital has hidden history due to the mud flood. Just take a good look. You can't deny the proof. The proof is in the pudding or the mud. Okay, so a few more examples. Next time you see a building that has those cut off windows, just know there's history that lies beneath. Here's another example. You can't hide the truth for long. So this gives you an idea of the scale of the mud flood. Here's another. Take a good look. Take note of this. This is a photo of New York in the 1800s, completely empty. Let me repeat. New York, completely empty. It's unheard of. Now here's a photo from the 1849 gold rush, San Francisco. There are men who look like they're a mix between Mongoloid and Negroid. Where do you suppose they came from? So here's another example of that architecture that symbolizes predecessor builders. Here's a modern day leftover building from that. And as mentioned before, I snapped this here in Detroit. And one more in Iowa because I don't want this to be lost upon you. So what history were they trying to hide? See, usually they won't try to hide it. They'll try to take something of our history, pervert it, and reverse the meaning, and then make us think that it's evil. Or it's just something that we shouldn't be concerned about. For an example, Queen Khalifa was a Moorish empress that ruled over Tartary and the Golden Kingdom of Kush or Ethiopia, which stretched from Hawaii to South America and so much more. She was also the queen of the Olmecs and the Zai people. So they'll take our story and just rebrand it. They'll take our history and they'll rebrand it. But you can't hide the truth for long. That's why you have this 12,000-year-old underwater city with a pyramid and energy field off the US coast, specifically Louisiana, which was the area of ancient Egypt. So jumping back, you have these symbolic forefathers, Japheth, Shem, and Ham, who were the progenitors of all races. Those races went to different lands. There was a lot of migrating that took place. And you have descendants of the migrating and intermixing of the Mongoloid and Caucasoid and Negroid. And this is how you have somebody like this who ends up in Mexico 12,000 years ago, with these features that are unlike modern day Mexicans. And these features resemble the Mende regions in West Africa and the Jai regions in China. But of course, it didn't stop in Mexico. You have migration going all through South America. Here's a woman from Brazil 11,500 years ago. Take note of her features. So during the migration, you had Moors from northern Africa that ended up in Spain. These are the Berber Moors of Islamic faith. Pause to read just so you'll know. All right, so the Berbers from North Africa ended up in Spain. All right, and when did the Moors get kicked out of Spain? On January 2nd, 1492, King Boabdil surrendered Granada to the Spanish forces, and in 1502, the Spanish crown ordered all Muslims forcibly converted to Christianity. Some persecutions happened, and in 1609, the last Moors still adhering to Islam were expelled from Spain. Who pushed the Moors out of Spain? Of course, the Reconquista happened with the Christians, and the Moors from the 8th century ruled most of the Iberian Peninsula. Then you have Ferdinand and Isabella telling the Jews to get out, 1492. Then on August the 3rd, 1492, Christopher Columbus had the king and queen finance his voyage. It says king and queen of Spain, but at that time it was the Iberian Peninsula. So we know Christopher Columbus didn't take these boats by himself. So who else was on those boats? Well, like always, you ask a great question. Okay, so Christopher Columbus was not by himself. It was mentioned that one of his helpers was Juan Garrido. So, who else was in the crew? 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean with a black navigator from Spain named Pedro Alonso Nino. He was called El Negro, the Black, for his notable trade in Africa. Never mind, we'll get to that in a second. So right now they're saying that he came from a trade in Africa. Here's an old document with details that we can pull from about those voyages. And can't forget to mention the Alhambra Decree was one of the driving forces for the elimination of the Jews in Spain. Okay, and for this article, I'm going to be pulling from the Clocentra. So I'm going to pull from the Caribbean Archaeology Program from Florida Museum for this Christopher Columbus article. And it says between 86 to 89 men accompanied Christopher Columbus on his first voyage, 20 on the Nina, 26 on the Pinta, and 41 on the Santa Maria. And then we have a listing of the crew members by the vessel. Pause to take a look. This is from the Pinta. Take note of the last names. This is from the Nina, Santa Maria, and a list of the men that were left at the Navidad after the sinking of the Santa Maria. And the Santa Maria sank on Christmas Eve, so that's the reason in Spanish why on Christmas you'll hear Feliz Navidad, paying homage to these men that were left at Navidad. Now take a look at those names again next to how they identify. A lot of them identify as Moorish. So the men on the ship with Christopher Columbus were Moors and Jews. During this time in the other side of the world, you had the Huns that were in control in Asia. Take note of the time this man lived. From 1227 from 1502. How? Anywho, of course, when they arrived, you had indigenous Americans that were already here. But of course, as time went on, we were replaced by modern day Native Americans. Let's take a brief look at how that happened. Here's an article from the Oklahoma Eagle. 98% of African Americans are in fact Native Indians and are owed millions. Here's a descendant of an indigenous American. Today, you might just call her African American, but that would be an inaccurate description. Pause to read. The tens of millions of Black Americans, or rather Indians, who have disappeared after 1492 did not all die in the Holocaust inflicted within America. Hundreds of thousands were shipped to Europe and Africa as Indian slaves. The whole slave trade story was given to all of us in reverse. A mass colony of Africans were not shipped from Africa to America. The truth is that Black Indians were shipped from America to Europe. They were then shipped from Spain to Africa as commodity for African resources. These black Indians, now mistaken as African Americans, were shipped back to America and classified as African slaves. This part of our history is what the school systems fail to mention in history programs. Pause to read. North America utilized Indian slaves for construction, plantations, and mining of the North American continent, but more frequently in their outposts in the Caribbean and the metropolis of Europe. So it says between 1650 and 1730, at least 50,000 Indians were exported by the English alone to their Caribbean outposts. Between 1670 and 1717, far more Indians were exported than Africans were imported. In the southern coastal regions, entire tribes were exterminated through slavery compared to the disease war. And just so you know, a lot of them were in Florida. Pause to read some more. Indian displaced from the fur trade in the north migrated south, where plantation owners armed them to hunt for slaves living in the Spanish mission communities. In another instance of Indian and colonial complicity in the slave trade, the British had established ties with the Chickasaw, who were surrounded by the enemies on all sides in Georgia. Pause to read the rest. Here's a photo of an indigenous Indian. Side note, a lot of y'all have relatives that look like that here in the United States. Here's my great-great-great-grandmother. Here's my great-grandmother who had on her Native American gear all the time. Like, all the time. And side note, I actually traced my family history on my dad's side all the way back to 1812. And my ancestors were involved in the Trail of Tears. And there's a lot of you who have history here. Just gotta tap into it. Pause to read this. The Indian slave trade covered an area from far west and south as New Mexico northward to the Great Lakes. I'm so glad this says that the Great Lakes are northward. It's no way that Michigan is the Midwest. I'm sorry, I just had to say that. We are the true north. Okay. Pause to read. It's an important bit at the bottom there. Slavery was part of the larger strategy to depopulate the land to make way for European settlers. It still happens today with gentrification. Not slave trade, but just different strategies, like raising the rent and pushing certain people out. Pause to read this. Talks about the transatlantic journeys. Show me the ships. Here's another important part. Pause to read. As the Indian slave trade gave way to the African slave trade by the late 1700s, Native American women began to intermarry with imported Africans, producing mixed-race offspring whose native identities became obscured through time. This actually happened in my family. I personally have a couple of acres on native land that was inherited through this intermarrying. So the lineage of my family actually substantiates the claims in this article. In the colonial project to eliminate the landscape of Indians, these mixed-race people simply became known as colored people through sporadic erasure in public records. And it says in some cases in Virginia, even when people were designated as Indians on birth or death certificates or other public records, their records were changed to reflect colored. The turban was a style of head covering favored by many Southeast Indian tribes, and we still keep that tradition alive today. We carry on a lot of these traditions through our ancestral memories, and we're connected to ancestral trauma. So to review, we went over a good amount of symbolism from the Bible, Greek mythology, and the Egyptian text. We compared the creation stories between the Bible, Greek mythology, and Egyptian text. We went over ancient Greeks, Genghis Khan, Prester John, and a plethora of other relating topics. And now for the driving point. Here's what I want you to have ingrained in your mind. The entire Bible is symbolic. It's an allegory. It should not be taken literal. It mainly refers to heaven and earth and its creation in the conscious and subconscious mind. We are literally in the matrix. Numbers 18:15. Everything that opened the matrix in all flesh, which they bring unto the Lord, whether it be of man or breast, shall be thine. Nevertheless, the firstborn of man shalt thou surely redeem, and the firstling of unclean beasts shalt thou redeem. As I mentioned before, you have different chakras and different bodies. Right now, you are operating through your physical body majority of the time. When you sleep, you're operating through your astral body. When you use your voice, you're using your throat chakra. Your pineal gland, your third eye chakra. Manifestation, your root chakra, which is why that's the chakra that's most focused on in our society. So the powers to be can bring in manifestation through your root chakra, through entertainment, through music and movies. Sound manipulation of the frequencies is one of the tools that keeps people blind to the matrix. Pause to read this quote. For by self-knowledge, I do not mean mere knowledge of the ego, but also knowledge of nous, that mind or spirit which is represented by the snake. Remember snake, the The Taurus field, the Merkaba, the aura, the Sri Yantra, they're all the same thing. It's your energy field. But as above, so below. As within, so without. Everything in life has their own energy field. This is why an apple grown with love gives you better nutrition. The same way everything in existence follows the Fibonacci sequence, everything has a toroidal field. From your cells to the entire Earth, every planetary energy affects your body in a different way. This is why when you have the planetary energy of Mars in retrograde, it'll affect you in a certain way. Same thing with every other single planetary energy. As above, so below. Everything in life can be broken down by the numbers, and astrologers are the master mathematicians. You have more chakras than the one you're taught about, but you have to be in tune with these before you can go past those. A lot of the symbolism in the Bible points to these. I want you to take a look at these Bible verses for examples. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. This means channeling your higher self. It also refers to the sun and the stars and heaven. Jesus said, I am with you for only a short time, and then I'm going to the one who sent me. The sun is with us during the daytime, then it goes back to the one who sent him. So, in closing, imagine, if you will, that our reality to be a holographic universe, a reflection, a duplicate, a copy of a master universe, a master reality, making this a dream or a school of thought where your thoughts literally create your reality, and you're given the power of free will, or perhaps an illusion of free will. But the end point is the reason for your incarnation. And your journey through this human experience is all powered through your conscious and subconscious mind, mainly your subconscious mind. And one of the mental ways for you to exit this matrix is to find that door in your mind, open it, and be free. Here's something to think about. Your physical body is tuned to a certain frequency in order to experience this third-dimensional physical realm. You have the power to ascend past the frequency that's keeping you locked here, but there are certain tools that are being used to keep you in the same position that you're in. And one of those tools is going to be entertainment. Your body is being manipulated through sound frequency. For an example, in another lecture, we talked about cymatics, the effect that music vibrations has on water. Take a look at the differences between 432 tuning and 440 tuning. And if this is the effect that it's having on water, and your body is made up of mostly water, what type of effect do you think it'll have on you? The amount of water in the human body ranges from 45% to 75%. The average adult human body is 50 to 65% water, averaging around 57 to 60%. The percentage of water in infants is much higher, typically around 75 to 78% water, dropping to 65% by 1 year of age. This is why we have no problem remembering those nursery rhymes, because at that age we're mostly water. So the vibrations stick with us. Take a look at this fact. Ancient instruments such as the Tibetan bowls, Pythagoras monochord, ancient flutes have been found to use 432 Hz as their base pitch. 432 Hz, the magic number everybody is talking about. It is said to be the natural frequency of the universe, to have cosmic healing powers, and to attract masses of audience to our music. Pause to read the rest. So the Bible is also a book about the numbers that's relating to heaven and earth and your body. And here's one example. We talked about the chakras, and here's a little passage that tells you how the 144,000 in the book of Revelation has to deal with the chakras. You see 7 appears quite a few times. Here's how often 7 shows up in the book of Revelation. Pause to read this. Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of Yah. Then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. So again, as above, so below. Job 20:14. And hopefully by now you'll be able to decipher a verse like this. Yet his food in the stomach is chained to the venom of the cobras within him. In the Exit the Matrix, the Sims lecture, we went over the significance of the snake, especially in regards to the firmament and the magnetic North Pole and inner Earth. We went over the meaning of Ouroboros. But as above, so below. As within, so without. Egyptians also knew about the significance of the snake, the importance. Because it's within you, it represents your kundalini that goes through and up your spine and your chakras. It connects you to our electromagnetic field. This is how you receive your energetic spiritual downloads. through your crown chakra, to your pineal gland, through your entire chakra system. The cobras within represent your ascension, your spiritual awakening. This is why it's extremely important to decalcify your pineal gland. And by balancing and detoxing your physical body, you're able to explore your etheric body, your astral body, your mental body, your casual body. From the moment you're born, Chronos is eating away at your life. But it's up to you to find the power within. You have to lift the veil. In the same way, you can go within our flat earth plane, you can go within yourself. You have the black sun, and you have your sun. You have your intuition, and you have your mind, your brain. One, you know it's there. The other is within. You have to go within to find it. Same thing with our black sun. It's all connected. The creation story is the creation of you. So then, history, his story, is nothing but your story. So, whatever you do, don't let it be lost. If you have found this lecture to be helpful, useful, or informative to you, please share it with somebody else who would also find it enjoyable. Please be sure to like and follow, and stay tuned for more. I'm already working on the next lecture, which will be ready shortly. Thank you guys for watching. Take care of yourself and each other. I love you. Peace. Lost History, out! So we spoke about the ark and how Noah was commissioned to build the ark. Now keeping in mind that everything is symbolic, I would like to show you what I believe the ark stands for. So, the firmament. The definition, the vault or arch of the sky. First three letters in arch is arc. Arc, the apparent path described above and below the horizon by a celestial body such as the sun. Something arched or curved. A sustained luminous discharge of electricity across a gap in a circuit between electrodes. All of these definitions can be used. The Bible also mentions the Ark of the Covenant. So the Ark is referring to the firmament. Here's what a arc dome looks like. This is a arc dome, the same one that they have at CERN. Alright, this is a arc dome. So the ark is referring to the firmament above us, the heavens. The Ark of the Covenant is referring to the ark in your head. Alright, be aware. It's all symbolic. Remember that Noah was a representation of Nut. Nut is the goddess of the sky, stars, cosmos, mother, astronomy, and the universe in the ancient Egyptian religion. She was seen as a star-covered nude woman arching over the earth or as a cow. And here's that depiction here, her being the ark. And since Noah has been compared to Nut, Noah built the ark. So the creation story is talking about the creation of heaven and earth. But remember what heaven means. It's the firmament, the ark of the world. So I'm going to leave you with that until the next lecture. I love you. Peace.
Today I'm going to show you why thunder proves the dome above us. Thunder needs to hit a solid object to occur. You can't have a thunder without a starting point. This is easy to demonstrate. Here is a good example of what I mean.
I first bring out my Van de Graaff generator, then fill a bottle with water. I then place that on top of the Van de Graaff generator. I turn the Van de Graaff on, and this happens.
The sound of the thunder proves that there is a dome above us, because thunder doesn't produce multiple explosions, rather it produces one explosion sound. They call the thunder sound a thunderclap. This is because it sounds like a clap, but that clap has echo to it which make it sound like multiple sounds. In order to have an echo, you'll need to be inside a closed area, because sound waves needs to hit an object for an echo to occur. Here is a video of a guy blowing a balloon inside a nuclear power plant. When slowed down it sounds just like thunder. Light travels much faster than sound waves. That's why we see lighting occurs before the thunder sound. There are so many evidence for the dome. Sun dogs, rainbows, thunder are some of the ones that prove the firmament above us. The earth is flat, closed, and stationary. Space is fake. Thank you for watching.
5D Mystery School. 5D Mystery School.